Welcome back to another episode of the Open Source Cafe. Really excited for this one. We've done quite a few sessions already on things related to K8s like securities and management and things like that. But today we're talking about an extremely important point, monitoring your cloud and Kubernetes costs. So money, money, money. And today we have some very special guests over here with us, Alex and Webb. Really appreciate you giving the time and joining us. Before we get started, would you like to tell our viewers a little bit more about yourself? Let's start with Alex.
Sure. Yeah, Kunal, thank you so much for having us. Super excited to be here. So my name is Alex Thilen. I lead business development at Kubecost, and it's been an amazing time and super excited to talk more about what we do in our open source projects today.
And I'll echo what Alex said. Kunal, awesome to be here. Thanks for having us. My name's Webb. I'm one of the original authors of the Kubecost project, one of the original co-creators. I am CEO of the company behind Kubecost, and I was a product manager at Google working on these similar types of problems before we launched the Kubecost open source project.
Amazing, and really excited for to have this conversation with you all. Some of the great minds in tech, and definitely folks would get to learn a lot. We saw that there was a survey posted around the end of June in 2021 by CNCF related to the Kubernetes cost monitoring, right? So can you maybe give us a summary about what you learned and what you analyzed from that?
Sure. Yeah, happy to jump in, and Webb, jump in here wherever. But I think the survey was super interesting. This was conducted by the CNCF and the FinOps Foundation. It was a bit of a collaborative survey. And what they found was that Kubernetes spend was increasing at a rate faster than Kubernetes adoption, which I thought was super interesting. And the second part of that was super interesting is they also found that majority of teams actually did not have any sort of chargeback or accurate Kubernetes cost management in place. And so it's, as much as teams are leveraging Kubernetes for the benefits such as, scalability, agility, portability, it's just this cost issue and how much those costs are increasing is certainly presenting itself as a friction and a challenge to adopting the service at scale. So I think that there's a lot more that we can dive into there, but in short, we're seeing that Kubernetes adoption is increasing fast, spend is increasing even faster, and there's not a lot of specific tooling to track these costs accurately.
Yeah, I think Alex said that really well, and I would say that it mirrored what we see when we talk to users or early adopters of Kubecost itself. Right, it was not uncommon to see teams either spending millions or even tens of millions a year on Kubernetes and not have visibility in place. Whether that visibility was like a rough approximation that was, oftentimes inaccurate, or just total lack of visibility. Or B, a lot of times we would talk to teams that were betting on Kubernetes. They were in the early days of their journey. And they identified that when moving from, say, EC2, directly, they were losing a bunch of visibility they had, right? Because of the abstraction layer of Kubernetes, they couldn't answer these basic questions. And a lot of them, that is almost like a sticking point, right? Of I need to solve this before I'm, ready to go all in on Kubernetes and, get to the level of some of those other teams of, millions or tens of millions.
And just to get even more specific, if we look at that survey, I think it said only 12% of teams have accurate showback or chargeback. And so I think the natural question is just well, why don't more teams have it? Why is this so hard? And it kind of goes back to what Webb said, right? Where it's fundamentally, this is just a difficult technical challenge because of how teams are running containers. They're in multi-tenant mode. They're dynamic, they're constantly scaling. So you can't have this sort of simple cost model. So we see that teams require specific tooling, and that is our mission. That's 100% what we're focused on, is just to be super deep in Kubernetes land, super deep in cost monitoring, and that's where we want to address our users and help our users and customers with specific tooling.
Amazing. And since we're talking about monitoring, the point that comes to my mind is, how do you decide, like, tools can be helpful, but if you don't have a good foundation, like when you're setting up the foundation for your monitoring, how do you figure out, like, what do you, like, basically what to monitor? And when we talk about like cost estimations, I was talking to someone at KubeCon, and when we were talking about cost, they mentioned that they have been having trouble with estimating the the cost, basically. So how do you deal with these two scenarios?
Yeah, I can take a first shot, Alex, if helpful. I think first and foremost, it's starting with like your situation, right? Like what are your goals at that particular time? Is it to, get awareness to different application engineering teams across your organization? Are you a small team and you just need awareness in your organization? Or are you looking to like really optimize spend and, are ruthlessly focused on cutting cost? Right. So there can be, based on that, there's kind of a variety of core metrics. I think there's two like common patterns or takeaways that we've seen is one, even if you say organize applications by namespaces, it's oftentimes really helpful to be able to see cost by different dimensions, right? So you can take a look at a cluster and say that, I have, in number of namespaces, costs across these namespaces are growing at this rate. To be able to drill into individual controllers or pods, like that is actually going to be the driver of cost and the actual like reason it would be increasing or, at a certain level. So being able to kind of slice and dice by different dimensions is super important. And then secondly, when we see teams start to think about the kind of optimization phase, we oftentimes like to start with one number, and it's this notion of cost efficiency, which is essentially your total cost minus your idle cost, right? So of every dollar you're spending, how much are you actually utilizing? Whether that's in, CPU, memory, disk, or something else. That number is oftentimes a very eye-opening starting point. We work with many teams because they didn't have that visibility before they started using Kubecost or OpenCost, that they may be at like single digit cost efficiency, meaning that like 90+% of their spend was going to idle or waste, right? So I would say those 2 points of cost by different dimensions and then cost efficiency. And then secondly, to touch on the estimation piece, there's a couple of different parts of this, but increasingly, like teams using Kubecost or OpenCost have cost in real time. So you can do things like, push a deployment with maybe auto scaling, and then you can use the data that is available in, 10 minutes, 30 minutes, 1 hour, et cetera, to project the future. That can be really, really helpful for teams. And then two is like, like Kubecost itself actually integrates with like your actual cloud provider so that you can reflect your enterprise discount and your usage of spot and savings plans and RIs, et cetera, et cetera. That is super valuable for actually reflecting estimates that, like future predictions or estimates that are relevant for your environment.
Sharing Webb. Alex, did you have something to add?
No, I think Webb summed that up super well. I'd say like the one thing that we see just in terms of customer journey is that a lot of this just starts with visibility, right? There's so many customers that come to us today, and the first question they ask is, hey, tell me what's been spent on Kubernetes across my organization. They just don't have an accurate picture of that. So it's really important to us that we give customers a view of how, their various cost drivers by whatever metric they want, whether it's a Kubernetes concept or a business concept. We want to make that data available in terms that make sense for their business. So focusing a lot on visibility is super important for us, and that's where these next phases kick off. Like it's very hard to do any sort of optimization or any sort of monitoring or governance if you don't have an accurate picture of what has been spent within your environment today. So Yeah, I think Webb shared that well. Thank you.
Amazing, and thanks for mentioning the auto scaling point as well, Webb. I think that was also extremely crucial. But so we talked about, like, you shared some examples and your experiences. Now, can you tell us a little bit more about how Kubecost is helping organizations with their cost monitoring needs, and then we can also talk a little bit more about the project OpenCost, which is what this session is all about.
Yeah, absolutely. So Kubecost itself can be deployed on any Kubernetes cluster. We have like deep integrations with AWS, GCP, and Azure, and also support like custom pricing sheets for like on-prem or even air-gapped clusters. So with just like a single Helm install in like minutes, you can actually start getting all of this visibility about your spend. Again, cost by like any dimension, measurement of cost efficiency, et cetera. And then from there, we start to generate insights for what actions you can take based on that. And that could be like right-sizing applications. That could be adjusting auto-scaling configurations. That could be right-sizing, like nodes or disk. There's a bunch of different things that teams, like most teams, can do to like really like manage spend effectively. Increasingly, we see a lot of teams actually able to cut spend by about 50%. And again, that's like doing it in the context of, your kind of reliability or performance goals and not compromising on those. So yeah, that's like kind of part one and part two of that journey that Alex, mentioned, which is visibility first, and then kind of like insights or optimizations. And then we would give like, the ability to generate recurring reports or alerts or budgets or set policies. All of these things can help teams manage that spend over time.
And I think a great way for users, and what many users do today to get started, is they deploy an open source project. And so for us, that's OpenCost. We recently onboarded OpenCost to the CNCF as a sandbox project, which is super exciting. And we worked with a number of founding contributors on this. So I'll just take a minute to just sort of explain what it is and how this came about. First and foremost, this was an initiative that happened just super naturally. We kept hearing all this feedback from both end users and vendors alike that the wheel was constantly being reinvented when it came to Kubernetes cost management, and everybody sort of had their own methodology or vocabulary and strategy and all these different things of how they're doing this. So it felt like there was a big opportunity to come together and say, okay, well, we have this open source project. How can we make this even more useful and create standards and specifications around it? So that's what we did. So in a nutshell, OpenCost is the combination of three things. First, it's an open source software project that customers can install today and get cost monitoring and cost visibility benefits from. And then second, it's documentation, guides, a specification essentially from a group of founding contributors such as Google, Adobe, AWS, Red Hat, all these amazing partners on how users can effectively use the product. And then third, we want to form a community around this, right? So we have an active working group. We're expanding our maintainer and contributor list. And so I think that, the main thing that we want to focus on is making this as useful as possible for end users and welcoming as much input from various platforms, various end users on how they're doing cost management and how we can work together to make this more consistent and standardized across the community. So super exciting to get it onboarded, but we're just starting. Like we've got a lot to do, and excited to keep growing the project.
Yeah, it's early days for OpenCost, and we're just so excited by the reception, engagement, feedback, et cetera, so far. One thing that Alex mentioned in kind of two pieces is we fundamentally feel that onboarding this to the CNCF is a critical part to building a community and having a neutral home so that others can integrate with it, others can build on top of it and build really cool functionality, because again now you get kind of not only cost visibility but real-time cost visibility, where again most teams essentially had none. And again, we are just pumped and think that there's going to be so many cool things built on top of it now that cost is a first class, open source, fully available like observability metric.
Thanks a lot for sharing, Alex and Webb. Can you maybe brief upon it as well? How does OpenCost relate to Kubecost? And let's say it gets accepted, like I'm sure hopefully it will, in the sandbox. And how would that change the governance things?
Yeah. So pretty cool. One thing, and this is very recent news. So it has been accepted. So like
Oh,
we are
nice.
going through the process of like giving it away, if you will, or again, like Alex says, kind of officially onboarding it. And we expect that to be done very, very soon. So yeah, like absolutely pumped about that. We like the way that OpenCost relates to Kubecost is that OpenCost itself is the core allocation engine or visibility engine for everything that Kubecost does, right? So when you talk about the cost of a pod or a deployment or a cluster or a set of clusters or anything in your Kubernetes environment, that's all coming from the OpenCost library. It is kind of, again, that like core model that is deciding, like given that you are an AWS and running an M5X large and have, 10 stateful sets, like here's the individual cost of each stateful set. So it is using that open source project to do that. It is also that open source project is also implementing all of the like detailed requirements of the spec itself. So you could say that like Kubecost itself is implementing the OpenCost spec via the like OpenCost open source implementation.
That clears things up. Thanks for sharing, Webb. And without further ado, let's just get started with it. Maybe Webb, you can show us a demo about how folks can get started, and yeah, we take it from there.
So we're just in a simple environment where we have a handful of workloads deployed in I believe this is still just a single cluster. And we're going to start by looking at cost by namespace, because that is a really common way for teams to like organize applications, right? And what you'll see, right away is that, for every namespace in this environment, we have costs, by all of these different dimensions, right? So CPU, GPU, RAM, storage, network egress cost, load balancer costs, and then this notion of shared costs, which we'll talk about. And then the really powerful metric, we discuss, which was this measurement of efficiency of each of these namespaces. So I'll actually start there and kind of work my way backwards. So first, if we just look at the efficiency of these individual namespaces, we will see that this is a measurement of all of the resources that are being consumed or requested by this particular namespace, and then the actual utilization of those weighted by dollars, right? So, if you're using a lot of really expensive GPUs and utilizing a very small percentage of those, you're going to have, low dollar utilization or efficiency, even if you're like really efficient with memory and have very little like idle memory, right? So, right away, this would be an opportunity to say, hey, we think we can be, more efficient with this particular namespace. From here, we can actually just dive into this namespace and look at everything running in it, right? So we can look at all of the, daemon sets and deployments. If we had jobs, other things like actually running, we would be able to like see all of those, right? So from here, we can keep going and say, okay, well, I'm really surprised that, Fluent Vent is so, like has such low utilization. We can go all the way down to the individual pods that we're running over this time window. We can look at this across any different, dimension. We can look at it, with cost over time or with actual like cost itself, or, total cost of this period. And then from here, I can actually go to like, the individual containers running in this environment, right? So all of this is backed by the OpenCost APIs, where I can just call this information directly. I can also, or like, request that information directly. I can take that and bring it to like kubectl via like the open source kubectl costs. I can take it and like display that information in, say, Grafana if I want to have cost there. I can also, because OpenCost is a Prometheus exporter, I can go and query these metrics directly in Prometheus. So if I want to, say, use Alert Manager or Grafana alerts and set, custom alerts based on spend or spend increases over time, etc., I can go and do that. So that touches on kind of those two cases, which is like actually understanding, why this like efficiency is what it is within this namespace. By drilling down into that namespace, we can actually understand it. And in that case, it's, things like fluent bit, like, actually, being really low efficiency, right? So, from there, then we can look again and think about like, well, what are the drivers of that efficiency? It's like all of these resources that are being, utilized. And so, what is likely the case there is that, those workloads are requesting a meaningful amount of either compute or memory, where they're not actually utilizing those, right? So obviously you want to be sensitive, given that this is in kube system, like namespace, but it would be an opportunity for you to like actually think about right sizing those workloads or doing that efficiently. And then like every other storage dimension or like cost dimension, we can just think about how this progresses over time. Again, we can like see this by any dimension. We can see this by absolute cost over time, etc. One other thing we can do, which is what you mentioned, is actually look at rates or estimates of this cost going forward. So that can be really helpful to say, based on the observations of the last hour or day, what do we think like I'm going to actually consume over the next month, right? And then, lastly, I'll just touch quickly on this notion of shared cost, which can be really valuable as teams grow and they have more and more either applications or tenants in their Kubernetes infrastructure. You may have like a shared, say, monitoring namespace, or you may have Prometheus running and you want to like share it based on labels, or maybe even want to share like system workloads across all of your tenants. This would give you the ability to aggregate those or allocate those back to all of your tenants so that you can distribute those costs accordingly, right? Sometimes we'll see, depending on your use case of Kubernetes, your actual shared resources may be a very significant part of your overall resources, right? If you're doing a lot of stuff with observability or logging or maybe even security tooling, it can be substantial. And again, allocating those back to teams gives a kind of like fair and accurate picture of what their share of those costs and what their overall like cost consumption actually is. So there's one other piece I just want to touch on here, which is this notion of idle cost. So this would be kind of one component of that cost efficiency measurement, which is idleness at the cluster level, right? So let's say you have 100 CPUs in a cluster. Your like workloads are requesting, say, 25 of those CPUs. The other 75 would be deemed idle at the cluster level, right? Because they're unrequested and unused. They're truly just like not being touched. So that is a really, again, important metric for us. It's like the other part of this overall efficiency measurement that is really valuable for, again, teams to start thinking about as they start like focusing on actually optimizing, spend and resources, et cetera. So I'll stop there, but let me know if I can answer more questions.
What providers does OpenCost support right now?
Yeah, Alex, you want to take that one?
Sure. Yeah. So our customers, we see them running in, I'd say, four primary locations, but then there's sort of like a long tail of locations thereafter. So it's very important to us that we have full feature parity and that we're platform agnostic. And that means that, we see users across AWS, GCP, Azure, and on-premise, including air gapped, right? So this, of course, deploys in a customer's environment. So there's no data leaving that environment, which makes it really easy for a lot of customers to get started quickly. But in general, like most places, if not all places that Kubernetes is running, like users should be able to use OpenCost. So
Totally. Yeah. Going back to your question about estimates, Kunal, like you can bring, pricing estimates or, custom pricing sheets on any provider out there. Again, as long as I believe it's currently either 1.11 or 1.12, Kubernetes version or above, OpenCost will be there and will run. It's a matter of like, does it have a billing API integration available for your environment, or is it relying on the custom pricing sheets that are provided? I would say one of the things that I'm like most excited about and most encouraged about is just since we launched OpenCost, which it's been what, Alex, a little over a month now, like a month and a half.
that feels right, but I will say that time flies. So definitely do not trust me validating that
maybe
timeline.
maybe 2 months. I know it's right at or a little under a month since we were accepted in CNCF, and we launched the project like very soon before that. So since that period, I've seen at least like 3 requests for an integration with IBM Cloud, Oracle Cloud, and Scaleway. I think that's super cool to like see the community, say I'd love to see an integration here. And my understanding is on like all 3 of those conversations are happening. And I believe on the Scaleway, there's actually a PR out for that integration now. So, that again is one of the pieces I'm really, really excited about and hopeful that we'll see just more and more integrations here really fast. So you'll have more and more environments. So I would say if you have an environment you want supported, go drop a note on the OpenCost repo and we'll see what's available and see what we can do.
Speaking of which, thanks a lot for sharing. How can folks contribute to OpenCost? Like, so how can they get involved in the community? Are there any at the end of the session? Would you like to mention any action items?
Yeah, I mean, first and foremost, go to opencost.io. You can view the GitHub repository there as well as our Slack channel. So if you want to get in contact with us and please give us feedback on the project, or if there's a specific topic for Kubernetes costs that you're passionate about, we would love your input, both on the specification or if you want to open like a GitHub issue, then our team can work through that with you as well. So yeah, I'd say like the biggest thing that we want to emphasize with this CNCF onboarding and CNCF sandbox project push is like this is now like a call for others to get involved. Like we want your feedback. We want to hear how you're using the project, and anything else where we can collaborate like is very much welcome. So yeah, I'd say opencost.io is the best place to get started, and we'd love to chat. Webb, any other thoughts there?
Yeah, I think there's tons of areas, again, brand new project. So look at it as like we're just getting started. I would say like, we've already had people get involved in like, building out opencost.io, whether that's like docs or like, the like website itself. If you want to get involved in like the core project, like, tons of things that are on the roadmap and will be built. You can either dive in with the contributing guide on the like repo, which is linked at opencost.io, or you can just come join our Slack community and hang out with a lot of core contributors, and see what areas interest you, again, whether that's like docs, code, or anything else.
Amazing. Well, thanks a lot for sharing, Web and Alex. And I'll leave all the links in the description below so y'all can check it out. Relatively new project, but as Alex mentioned, time flies, so get on it. And a little bit of a plug here. I've done if you want to learn more about Kubecost, I've done a video on it already. You can check out the links in the description below. And I'm also speaking at Container Days in Germany in September about Kubernetes cost monitoring best practices. So you can join that if you're attending the conference. And also DevOps World, I think, in Florida. So I'm excited. All right.
Amazing.
Really appreciate you giving the time, Webb and Alex. Thanks a lot for joining. I'm hopefully, folks would get involved and ask you questions in the Slack community. But thanks for watching, everyone. We'll see you in the next one, and have a great day. Bye.
Thanks for having us.